Hello and welcome to World Talks. I'm your host, Sascha Fahrbach. May 3rd marks World Press Freedom Day. We pause now to reflect on a critical pillar of democracy, the freedom of the press. Now, around the world, journalists continue to face harassment, imprisonment, censorship, and even violence simply for seeking and reporting the truth. From war zones to political hotspots, the dangers to reporters are real and growing. In an age where misinformation spreads faster than facts, press freedom is more vital than ever. Now joining us is Maryia Sadouskaya-Komlach, global engagement strategist, Free Press Unlimited, to discuss the state of journalism, the threats to press freedom, and what must be done to protect those who risk everything to keep the public informed. Thanks so much for joining us here on World Talks. Let's start. Now, I have this indication here from the Committee to Protect Journalists. Now, last year, over 300 journalists were imprisoned and reportedly imprisoned. What does this indicate and tell us about the state of the free press?
Well, it tells us that fortunately these people are still alive, because a lot of journalists were also killed last year, and 70% of them in Gaza, if I'm correct. However, the state of imprisonment is a serious indicator, because it shows that the governments all around the world are more and more increasingly open about the fact that they jail journalists for their media work. If 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, some governments would pretend and say, well, we arrested this person, but because of his corruption or drug accusations or whatever. Right now, very often they say, yes, we arrested that journalist because they, for example, tried to destabilize the situation. And this is a very worrying trend.
Now, why is that in your sense? Why are governments here being more open about jailing journalists here? What has been that inflection point to have this come about?
Well, I think we're still living in the post-first Trump election period, post-2016, when it became increasingly fashionable to accuse media of being biased, of taking sides, to kind of try to stop media, prevent media from being this holy grail of impartiality, objectivity. Of course, media are also helping in a way, because they have to fight for commercial sustainability, they have to fight for clickbait, and very often you can find an example of media not being ideal. However, of course, it's never a ground to put someone into jail. But across the world, journalism is under attack. It's under attack from politicians who very often choose journalism as an easy victim, and therefore later journalists and media have less societal support. When someone is arrested, when someone is jailed, if a decade or 2 decades ago, the society, like in case of Jan Kuciak in Slovakia, would really rise and change the government or demand accountability. Right now, the societies in the same countries are electing the people, the very same people they ask to go.
You mentioned Slovakia there. I want to jump in also further into the region, looking also namely at Serbia. Now, we've had recent strikes, we've had the student protests, and I just want to know, and also we've had the blocks by students of the national broadcaster in Serbia itself falling very, very low in the press freedom ranking. So, but at the same time, if we're looking at this, the government has now agreed to change this process and selection for media regulators. Is this a turning point for media independence in Serbia, or is this just a temporary concession?
Well, I mean, from just the looks of it, right, it looks like Serbia is now more advanced than Poland, because I believe Poland still has a criticized system, let's say, of a politicized approach in appointing the members of the council or the national regulator. But of course, these are just word games. The main thing in Serbia is less of whether the Broadcasting Council or Regulation Council is politicized, which of course is still important and has to be changed also as part of their striving to become the European Union member, but more about the government launching attacks on press and civil society, verbal attacks, of course, using the hate speech sometimes, or politicians that are associated with the government, and also, frankly, the very dire effect that the withdrawal of American funds will make now on the civil society sector and some of the media, because since the government could not support them, while they would not be wanted to be supported by such a government, they often relied on foreign aid. And now, coming back to the Trump effect, we have second election of Trump, and it looks like the United States are not going to support press freedom or civil society actors in the regions like Serbia. So therefore, I think the question you asked, whether the change in the Regulation Council appointment would be a significant step, no, unless there are other indicators that show that the Serbian government is on the way to make their country a true European Union member candidate.
And also, it's interesting on that point as well. I mean, you mentioned also governments taking these more overt tones about very much saying that they've taken in journalists. But at what point as well, and decision with USA as well, at what point, where's the accountability as well and the involvement of the public, of the audience? What is their role in all of this?
Well, I mean, the public is the people for whom you and I, as a former journalist, we should work for, right? The problem is that the access to the public is right now hurdled by the hegemony of social media and big tech platforms. I'm not sure if you already read the World Press Freedom Ranking, but you could see from Reporters Without Borders that economic constraints are actually put on the first place, despite all hardships, as the biggest factor of the decline in media freedom all around the world. So the public would support the media or the access to information only if the public is not confused, is not bombarded by contradicting messages, only if politicians and private actors are not competent to drag people away from the media in a way to communicate to them through social media platforms, through bots, so-called directly, and telling them that so that the traditional media should not be trusted. And don't get me wrong, I think it's very important to support citizen journalism and bloggers, but whoever calls themselves a press, because today is World Press Freedom Day, are also bound by ethical consideration, ethical charters. And this is something that is being overlooked, and therefore public is left confused. They very often don't really understand what's the difference between the TikToker they saw yesterday, let's say in Romania, right, and the media outlet. And this is where the media could also do a better job, frankly.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was curious about also disinformation. We're looking at how we keep that credibility in this huge proliferation of the time of AI, of misinformation, of social media. So what's your thoughts there? How do we keep that press freedom going, that balancing that credibility for news media and press with all the technology that's available to us?
Well, I think Poland gives a very encouraging early example where I think the Polish Ministry of Foreign Affairs has created the Resilient Council, which currently has representatives of mostly academia and some non-profit sector trying to advise Poland on how to deal with foreign information manipulation. I think it would have gotten even more credibility if the media's role would be recognized and media would be invited to advise the government in the same way as the other sectors do. But at least it shows this very horizontal approach where a government is trying to listen to other actors. Press itself will not be able to restore credibility in the eyes of people who are attacked by governments and companies. It's only responsible governments and companies can join efforts with the press to actually counter this threat. Because when we think that it's credibility of press, it's only one side of the coin. The truth is, it's credibility of any information that would influence people's lives, safety, and security. And if today we can dismiss that press is criticized for some mistake in covering the floods, tomorrow we may be in a great trouble, as people in Czech Republic already were, when people do not believe the governmental statement about the floods and just don't evacuate. And this is the goal of the disinformation actors who are trying to destroy the press as the first step on their road.
Mm-hmm. And one of those chief disinformation actors, very much the Kremlin. Now, let's take a look at Russia, what it has done with that horrible war in Ukraine, and how that's changed. I mean, Russia has cracked down on all kinds of criticism, labeling journalists foreign agents. How has that impacted press freedom? I mean, it might be an easy question, but also given, I want to ask, with this return of this deceased Ukrainian journalist who was given back to Ukraine, there's evidence of torture, and also I believe she's been given back without organs. What can we say about this with Russia's role, and if there's any kind of positives to learn out of this?
Well, I think we have to distinguish here from press freedom issues in Russia, which this year by Reporters Without Borders has been put on 170-something place, lower than Azerbaijan and Belarus, which to me is frankly startling because media there enjoy much more economic and political freedom than in these countries. And the case of Victoria Roshchina, a dear former colleague with whom I and my friends and my colleagues collaborated, who was a brilliant journalist, we see her right now on the screen, and who was tortured to death in the Russian captivity, while Russians knew very perfectly she was a Ukrainian journalist trying to actually uncover the shadow detention center for Ukrainian citizens there. Victoria is and was a bright war correspondent who never wanted to be a war correspondent. She was a perfect investigative journalist with this hunch to uncover the truth. And her killing is hopefully going to be one day investigated with the help of the world community, and Russia would be brought to justice. But her killing is rather raises a question on how journalists are protected, how quickly the politicians, for example, can get the release of journalists as among the first people to be released. Victoria died on the trip to hopefully be released in Moscow and exchanged for other prisoners from the Russia side, but maybe it was too late. So I think the case of Victoria shows that the accountability for the crimes against journalists, even from the governments like Russians who were eager to exchange her, just too late, should be actually much higher, and journalists should be among the first groups which are demanded to be returned. Coming back to Russia, I think the fact that journalists are called foreign agents there and that, of course, they're being hunted and criminalized is very sad. But the level of impact of journalists from abroad on the Russian populations is still visible. So we do hope that they will continue to do their brave work.
And of course, it's always tragic to hear that kind of story of journalists who are tortured and suffer an even worse fate. But also looking at some way towards the future on this day, do you see any kind of developments and that can somehow give journalists hope, or those who support a free press hope in looking towards this year or the near future?
I do. Well, first of all, again, congratulations, Poland. You raised several more positions in the ranking. I'm not sure it's because the press freedom in Poland became so wonderful or because everywhere else things went worse. But let's be frank, the very fact that Poland raised 16 places to the 31st place is a positive sign. The Czech Republic, although it has elections this year, but until now has been among countries in our Central European region an example of how things can gradually improve, including in the sphere of national broadcasting. And I think around the world, in other places, despite all the repressions, all the, for example, factors that force people in exile, a factor that gives hope is that media continue to work from exile, whether it should be for Nicaragua, Venezuela, whether it should be for Myanmar or for Belarus. Media do not stop working. Very often the statistics that we get about newsrooms that had to stop working come actually from a more well-off countries, but not from the countries where journalism is targeted most. So the resilience of journalism, the resilience of press, the ability of the newsrooms to continue bringing truth or objective reality to people is something that gives hope despite all the negative developments.
All right. I think on that note of resilience, I think that's a good theme for us on this day, but I think any day moving forward for press and those who appreciate it. So I want to thank you so much. Really comprehensive insights, an array of topics there. Maryia Sadouskaya-Komlach, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks, but there's much more coming up right here on TVP World, so stay tuned. Goodbye.